Welcome to the All Things Nintendo podcast. I'm Brian J. from Game Informer, and this is a weekly podcast to discuss all the biggest news and games from the world of Nintendo. Before Nintendo was the name in video games, one company dominated the industry in the 70s and early 80s. That company is Atari, and while it did fall off pretty drastically following the video game crash of 1983, the name persists and the logo remains one of the most recognizable logos on the planet. Today I'm joined by the CEO of Atari, Wade Rosen. Wade, how are you doing today?
Brian, I'm great. I'm happy to be here, happy to hang out with you and have these awesome cocktails.
Yeah, this is the first ever All Things Nintendo episode recorded in the dining room of my house. So excuse any echoes or weird sounds you may hear. The air conditioning is cranking, so apologies if there is any background noise there, but you'll probably hear some glasses clinking. We are drinking some cocktails that I recently made. So yeah, that is the situation we have right now. It's the show notes off the top. But you know, Wade, we have a time-honored tradition here on All Things Nintendo, and every time there's somebody who is a first-time guest on the show, we get to know them through the lens of Nintendo and their relationship with Nintendo. So we're going to ask you two questions here. First one is, what was the first Nintendo game you recall? Whether that is your first memory that you have with Nintendo, or just the first large impression that Nintendo left on you.
Yeah, that's a pretty easy one, and it's probably the common one, but it is Super Mario Brothers. And I remember being at a friend's house, watching them play it, and being absolutely mesmerized by a comic book come to life, or a storybook come to life. I've never seen anything like it, and I didn't even really know what I was seeing or how to process it at the time. And I don't know how old I was. I wasn't in school yet, but it is one of my earliest memories, actually, is watching Super Mario Brothers. So not only is it my first Nintendo memory, it might be one of my earliest memories, period.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked about it on this show. I'm sure people did not listen to the first episode at this point, but my first memory is going to my aunt and uncle's, or one of my first memories is going to my aunt and uncle's house, and I don't know which one happened first, to be honest. One of them had Super Mario Brothers / Duck Hunt cartridge and Tetris. The other ones had The Legend of Zelda and Bubble Bobble, which you and I have geeked out over Bubble Bobble in the past.
Love Bubble Bobble. Oh, one of the greats.
It is one of the greats. But those are some of my earliest memories were going to my family's houses, my extended family, and playing those games. And I was oh, this is really cool. And of course, I got great jumping off points. Super Mario Brothers, one of the most important video games of all time. Legend of Zelda, again, one of the most important video games of all time. Tetris, one of the greatest games of all time. And it's you have these incredible jumping off points, and Super Mario Brothers, like you said, is just one of those games that just if you had any knowledge of video games before that, that was the paradigm shift of, okay, the game has changed, quite literally. Atari in the early days really laid the foundation for what a video game is, right? You have so many classics on the 2600, and when things kind of went south for Atari in the early 80s, it was okay, well, that was a cool fad. And then Nintendo was you thought, because here's Super Mario Brothers, here's The Legend of Zelda, here's Metroid, and so many great games just came out of that early era, and it was okay, this is more than a fad, and in fact it was an entirely whole new industry.
Yeah. Well, and that first series there, I mean, it was so nascent. People didn't understand what a video game cycle was, what a console cycle was. And we, it's funny, we look at that and it's this huge crash. And it's really oh no, that was time for a new console. But there wasn't that recognition. In fact, the Atari 7800, the chipset and the specs of it are really comparable to a Nintendo. And it was supposed to release at that same time. It was actually supposed to release in 83 and predate the Nintendo by about a year. Mm-hmm. And Atari, many people know this, but Atari had the opportunity to license the Nintendo and be the exclusive. They had the opportunity to make that the next Atari, and they turned it down. But what they ended up developing was very similar. It wouldn't come out until 1987, after the Trammell family had taken over Atari at that point. But it could have come out in 83. And I oftentimes wonder, like, what would the world have been like if
Oh my god,
an
yeah.
Atari 7800 had come out in '83? You know, if you think about those early Nintendo games and how primitive those were, and then what they eventually evolved to, I wonder if the crash would have ever happened, or if we would be looking at kind of a Nintendo Atari showdown like in the 16-bit era, you know, with the Nintendo and the
Atari does
7800.
what Nintendo don't.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I feel like I've heard that somewhere.
Yeah. Well, my multiple-time interview Al Nielsen, who was one of the people who was responsible for that marketing campaign back in the early '90s, he might have something to say about that
Yeah.
that slogan if Atari adopted it. I mean, it's one of the great what-ifs, right, in
Right.
video game history. It's like, you know, what would that world look like if, like, the Nintendo PlayStation actually came to fruition and that wasn't just this one prototype that now floats around and is just completely priceless.
Well, Atari, it's also strange. I've thought about this a lot. I'm not sure there's another example in any industry where the number one player in an industry voluntarily steps out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, in '83, '84, that's what happened. Granted, it was a pretty rough year, and I think those numbers scared everybody at the time. But, I mean, it wasn't like the crown was taken. They just stepped away. There was none.
Yeah.
And the industry, to your point, had been written off. Although nobody told the consumers, right? Like, just the analysts. Just the analysts said it was done, but the consumers didn't.
Well, to your point earlier about, like, it was the end of a console cycle and, like, we had no idea what a console cycle even was because it's like, okay, I bought my video game system, I guess I'm set for life.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't ever really explained because we didn't have, like, these upgrades that, like, we were so used to. Like, nowadays we're so used to buying a new phone every 2 years or
Yeah.
whatever. We're so used to, like, okay, well, my computer is, like, 5 or 6 years old, maybe I should upgrade.
And you're
like,
getting 5 or 6 years. You're ahead of me. I gotta learn your secrets there, Brian. I'm lucky if I get 3.5.
My gaming PC that you saw earlier today, I believe is 8 years old now, and it still runs almost every game. So I'm doing pretty well with that.
Good job.
So, but to your point, like, you know, now, like, back in the early 90s when Nintendo, they even struggled with the transition to a new console cycle. I've been watching a lot of, like, old clips of, like, news footage of, like, when, like, the NES was happening and the SNES, and there were so many people like, I already have a Nintendo. My kid already has a Nintendo. Now they're saying I need to buy a whole new system and, like, it's not going to play any of the old games. Like, what is this scam? Like, they're just, like, basically, like, it's like these mob tactics that now we have to pay hundreds of dollars to get a new system to play the new games. Like, what is this? And it's like, people just weren't conditioned to that at that point.
No, and I mean, it barely even exists anymore, right? Like, platforms just kind of, like, new console today is not like it was even from PS2 to PS3, you know, where you have to start completely over. A lot of the games transfer now. It's more of a platform play. Like, it's a softer transition. There's usually a halfway point. You know, 3.5 years in, in a couple of years, a year and a half, we're going to be getting, you know, the PS5 Pros and the Xbox Series X pluses or whatever, and
Good, make that name more convoluted.
yeah, exactly. Just toss a couple more letters on it. But I think, you know, what was fun back in the day was every console generation was like a toss-up. Like, it didn't matter who dominated the last one. It was like, all right, well, who's going to dominate this one? And it was like starting from scratch. And I think it's really tough on a business model, but it's really fun as a consumer because you got to, like, sit there and cheer on your team. And I remember, like, this begrudging acceptance as time went on of like, letting go of Nintendo and, like, embracing PlayStation as I watched PS1 and PS2 come out and be like, and I always loved, I mean, actually it was funny, I kind of moved to the Dreamcast having not really been into Sega and then eventually getting super into the Sega Saturn. But every console generation was like a starting over point. And I always felt like my loyalty was pretty deep, but there was a point at which I'm like, I want to play Final Fantasy VII. I really want to play Final Fantasy Tactics. Like, I guess I'm gonna jump ship and I'm gonna move over to PlayStation.
I did that a couple of times.
Yeah.
I remember when Tony Hawk's Pro Skater came out. I was like, it's N64, and I knew it was coming to N64, but I knew that was the inferior version.
Yeah.
So I was like, because I think like the N64 version, it had like a lot of the licensed music, but it was like 1-minute clips or something, if I'm not mistaken. And I was like, well, I want the full songs. And then I also knew there was like, I loved like WCW versus NWO, Revenge, and World Tour. Like, I liked professional wrestling back then, so like I was all about those games, and I was more about those than I was like the WWF games, which a lot of people point to as like, oh, well, these are the greatest wrestling games of all time. I'm like, well, give me the N64 WCW games any day of the week.
Those were great.
But like,
I wasn't even into wrestling, and I loved those games.
They were so much fun. That's why I had hope actually for the AEW game, because it's made by the same developer that made those, and they used those WCW games on N64 as like their point of inspiration.
Really?
Unfortunately, it was pretty feature barren from what our editor Marcus Stewart, who reviewed it, was, and he's also our resident wrestling aficionado, so he would know best. But I think that the N64 was such a great console for like all those different like kind of cultural milestones. Like I've said it several times on this podcast, like Mario 64 was the blueprint for every 3D platformer for like several years after it came out. And The Legend of Zelda was the blueprint, Ocarina of Time was the blueprint for every other 3D game that came out during that time. But then when like PlayStation 1 came out, and I was hearing all these things about Final Fantasy 7, my cousin was bringing his PlayStation to our grandparents' house during like Thanksgiving, and I was playing Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. I was like, I gotta get myself one of these PlayStations. And then I saw like they had like a WCW game on there, and I was like, they had like FMV sequences with like the wrestlers walking out. I'm like, oh my god, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen.
You know what? The best part about the FMV sequences, I remember the Final Fantasy VII ones being like, how can graphics ever be nicer than this? Like,
right?
I was like, there's no pixels. Like, what could possibly be better? And now I watch the FMV sequences and I'm like, oh, these are blobs. these are smooth blobs. Like,
the most artifacted video you've ever seen.
I just remember this video of Cloud on a motorcycle, like going somewhere and being like, that is beautiful. I can't imagine how anything will be more beautiful than that. And now looking back and being like, oh, well, sometimes you're wrong.
I remember I went before I had an Xbox 360. I was in college and I had an original Xbox, and I was playing like Forza Motorsport 2. And I was telling my dad at the time, I was home for like winter break or whatever, and I was playing Forza Motorsport 2, and I was like, yeah, I really want the Xbox 360. Like, it looks like the graphics are incredible. And he looked at the Forza Motorsport 2 that I was playing as I was telling him this, and he's like, how would you ever need graphics better than this? This is like the greatest game. This is the greatest, because I used to play games with my dad all the time. We played SNES constantly, and like, so the N64 was where he kind of fell off, because he was like, this controller is too complicated for me. I don't know about navigating 3D spaces.
Fair point. Yeah.
Like, that was a big leap for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Like, if you didn't grow up with it, it's like learning a new language. Like, if you didn't like learn it in childhood, it is so much more difficult learning it as an adult. I mean, I'm trying to learn Spanish right now, and it's very difficult. But meanwhile, I learned French in high school, and that came a lot easier. But
you're better than me in general. The languages were never my forte.
But like, I got my dad Overwatch because they called me like back in like, I guess it was like 2017 or 2018. They were like, we want something to play VR, and I was like, well, I thought this in my head. I was like, the system that like probably requires the least amount of me acting as their IT guy is going to be the PlayStation VR. Like, if I tell them, hey, get an Oculus Rift, they're going to be calling me constantly, be like, oh my god, like the PC won't recognize this driver or whatever. Or if I get them the HTC Vive, they're going to be like losing their minds trying to set that up in a room. So I was like, all right, get a PlayStation VR and a PS4. And then my dad started playing around, because it came with Uncharted 4, and he started playing around with that. And he later told me that he was just playing the intro sequence over and over again because he couldn't get past like the second mission. But he's like, this is the most incredible thing I've ever seen in my life, because his last point of reference in gaming is the Super Nintendo, playing Donkey Kong Country, playing Super Mario World, playing Super Mario Kart. So like, to jump from that, and like, he's seen me play N64 and PS2 and stuff, but to Uncharted 4, where it's like almost photorealistic in the visuals, it's just such a crazy thing. And I got him Overwatch for Christmas one year, and he had no idea how to navigate a 3D space while also aiming. He
I
had
know.
no idea about the dual
And
analog
I like
sticks.
how you got him Overwatch of all the things your dad.
Well, I was like, hey, we could play this together. And we did play it together a few times, and he actually really started enjoying it. I wrote a feature about it actually on GameInformer.com about like how he kind of helped me get into gaming, and then like I was repaying the favor of getting him back into gaming. And now it's funny because we were just at my parents' house in Pennsylvania for the 4th of July weekend, and he's now getting my nephew into gaming. My nephew's 4 years old now, and he's like playing the Paw Patrol video game with him.
Awesome.
And it's like it's so much fun to like just be like, hey, I remember when like you and I were doing this. And then like we still like, when I come over, I'll bring the Switch and we'll play Mario Kart 8, because that was one of the games we grew up playing, was Mario Kart on Super Nintendo, and it's so cool to see like the new generation of Mario Kart.
You know, and a friend of mine told me about this thing that that someone he knew was doing with their children, which I thought was so smart. And if I have the discipline, I'll do it with mine. But to slowly introduce them to games, so rather than just drop them in the deep end with like these beautiful photorealistic graphics every year, to like keep them in a time period or a decade, or so it's, you know, they started with like Atari games, and then they moved up to Nintendo, and then Super Nintendo. And so like as they're going through, they're actually they're playing some of the old Ultimas even, you know, and stuff, just these really classic seminal works, and moving through this time frame, and then, you know, you kind of build up to your Uncharted 4, so to speak. I mean, because I think what you're describing also is like we're kind of touching on the human condition a little bit, which is like when I played Donkey Kong Country, it was mind blowing, or you know, Mario or Final Fantasy VII, and now, you know, my expectations of graphics are just radically different. Like that's just, I mean, that's what it means to be human, right? And so how do you like capture that beauty in the simplicity of something like Breakout, which has had entire books written about it. I mean, entire books have been written about Breakout when that was originally made, and yeah, like how, like what do you do to get back to that point? And I don't know what the answer is. Like there's probably not an answer. It's not like good or bad, but I do think there's like, you know, being in this position at Atari, it's giving me an opportunity to go back and just really play things and just enjoy them and be like, oh wow, like River Raid is cool. Like I never played River Raid before. Like River Raid is great. Like Yars is a personal favorite, Berserk, and I've really grown to love them. But what would it have been like to play those as like my first games? Probably would be an entirely different experience.
Oh, for sure. And I think you and I were approximately the same age.
Yeah.
We got lucky in that we came of age with gaming, I think. Like,
totally.
I remember the NES before the SNES existed, and the SNES, and like, you know, we kind of came along, like our awkward years.
I remember Atari. I remember there were Ataris every, you know, like when I was growing up, and I'd go over and be like, what is this? This is like a Nintendo. The Pac-Man's doesn't look great, but
we got a Pac-Man.
We got a Pac-Man right here.
And I'm holding my Pac-Man 2600 cartridge, and notoriously a bad port.
Notoriously bad. Those also ended up in the desert. Little known fact. I think some Pac-Mans ended up there. Obviously E.T.
A lot of E.T.
A lot of E.T. I think a fair amount of Pac-Man. There were a few others that I think made an appearance out in the desert. But the other ports, they figured it out though. I mean, it's kind of crazy to play these late in life Atari 2600 games. It's like playing, you know, Dragon Warrior 4 on the Nintendo. You're like, what is this? Like, this is unreal compared to where like Final Fantasy was, you know, and like playing some of those very late games, like California games, is just beautiful, or Solaris. It's just these really mesmerizing works of art. So it is funny to like be like, well, this is as good as it could get, and then a couple years later you're like, oh no, wait, we can crank out a little bit more here, racing that beam.
Yeah, and like it's interesting that like we kind of went through our awkward years approximately around the same time that the games industry did, because, you know, the transition to 3D.
What was the awkward years for you? What do you think they are? I'm
for
curious.
gaming?
Yeah.
I think the transition to 3D. Like the jump, because like Mario 64 nailed it.
Yeah.
Ocarina of Time nailed it, but not a lot of developers nailed that
Are you
jump.
saying
to 3D.
Bubsy 3D didn't nail it? That is a game that Atari is proud to own, and I can't wait to someday put a Bubsy 3. I'm joking.
I was gonna say, where was that in the Atari 50 collection?
Bubsy 3D. Bubsy 3D deserves its own like breakdown and what happened segment. Actually, I think it did have its own what happened, didn't it?
Matt McMuscles.
Yeah, I think he did one already.
I'm sure he did. He's
no, you're
prolific.
right. That was a totally awkward time. I actually, as awkward as that was, there is like a lot of iconic software. The awkward time that I always think of, though, maybe it's not the awkward time, but man, I think of like that, kind of that like Wii late PS2, Xbox 360. Again, good games, but like I feel like that's when things got like the shovelware really started coming out in earnest.
Oh, absolutely.
And just like be like, how many of these Wii games? Like, what's the approval process on these things? Or like, I just remember everything was gritty and everything was dark colored and everything, and I was like, oh, this is so, and yet like it was all a shooting gallery and it was all very like earnest, or not even earnest, but just like very dark and like with no levity whatsoever. And you're like, I like things as dark as the next person, but I usually like it a little tongue in cheek. That was just like, okay, we gotta be gritty because Grand Theft Auto like crushed it, and we gotta get those Grand Theft Auto dollars. So I always think of that as like this awkward time in gaming, and outside of like the seeds that were planted with like Demon's Souls, which eventually became like Dark Souls, like I just don't remember that much from that generation. I say that, and by the end of the episode I'll be like, oh, this and this, but I don't remember liking as much in the 360 Wii PS3 genre.
No, I
as
get
some of
that.
the others, yeah.
I mean, those games haven't aged as gracefully as like a PS4 title for sure. Like,
or I'd even argue a PS1 title to some degree. Like PS1 can look, it's blocky, but like I mean, I was looking at like Vagrant Story the other day. I don't know if you remember that one. It was a Square game. It's beautiful. It's like I'm like watching it, and they're like in it's not actually France, but it's there. It's clearly they were inspired by France, and they're like drinking wine at the beginning of the game. I'm like, I want to go there. Like that's amazing. Like how did they do this? But there's a beauty to like PS1, even PS2, that kind of I think became a little bit of muddiness with like that next genre. That I don't know. There's some exceptions to that, obviously, and I'll think of. I say this, and then there's a bunch that are going to hit me by the end of the episode. But that was like a weird time. And until Demon's Souls, I remember kind of falling out of love with games. And then that game came out, and I was like, oh wait, this is what a game can be. Like you better
not be trash talking Final Fantasy X, my favorite RPG of all
PS2.
time. That's PS2.
That's PS2. Of course not. I'm not trash talking Final Fantasy X. It's great. I would almost put that on the list, but 10 is amazing. But then, like again, PS3. Are you gonna put the Final Fantasy PS3 games on your list?
I mean, 13. I think gets more hate than it deserves.
I'm not saying fair. You could argue it's underrated, but like awkward. It's a little awkward.
It is
like,
awkward.
Yeah,
especially
10, which is just joyful, and 12, which isn't my favorite, but is like aesthetically beautiful and like really an interesting world, even if the story is like kind of paint by number. It's like 13 is that. I think that's a great example. Like Final Fantasy 13 is like the encapsulation of that generation. So when I think of the awkward phase, I always like that those years. Those are those weird awkward years.
Well, I won't tell our editor Wesley LeBlanc, who asserts that Final Fantasy 13 is the best Final Fantasy game.
Oh, all right. I don't really have too much of a dog in that hunt. I'm always been a little bit more of a Dragon Warrior, Dragon Quest guy, but
what's the best Dragon Quest game?
4.
Okay,
for sure.
Is that available anywhere? Like modern?
Yes, yeah, they've redone it a couple times. And I by then they'd renamed it Dragon Quest 4. I'm not sure what that's on, but That's amazing. The Super Nintendo ones, which weren't ported for a long time, are really good as well. But I think you were going to ask me at some point in time what my favorite. Oh no, it's on the DS. They did it on the. They brought it over on the DS. I thought they also did a Game Boy Color version, but maybe that was just Dragon Warrior 3 that they did it for. But I'll save a little bit of my love for Dragon Warrior for your later
My
question.
follow-up question.
Yeah.
Well,
I think
I was
there's
going to
a
get to
follow-up.
that because
Okay.
this has been officially the longest first Nintendo game, favorite Nintendo game segment.
Hey, are we still in it? Oh my gosh.
We are
Okay.
25 minutes deep here, and we're still on first Nintendo game, favorite Nintendo game. And the follow-up question, what is your favorite Nintendo game of all time?
So my favorite Nintendo game of all time is Dragon Warrior 4. And I credit that game to me spending thousands of hours playing RPGs. And until I saw Dragon Warrior 4, I did not think I liked an RPG. In fact, I thought it was boring and I didn't understand it, and you just put in the commands and it does it for you. I didn't get it. And like, now you don't really have to describe RPGs to people, but back in the day, you know, you talk about RPGs and people would be like, wait, so you don't play the game? You just tell it what to do in the game. Why would you do this? Why would you play this? And I think that's how I felt. And then a friend of mine, Dragon Warrior 4 is this very weird game because it was very late in the life cycle, and my understanding is you had to order it off of a mail order even to get it. It was $100 to order these things. So, pretty rare game. A friend of mine had it. His parents were really into RPGs, I think, and I remember being in his house and watching this unfold. There was a little bit of one of those Super Mario Brothers moments where you're like, oh, like, you know, synapses connecting, and you're like, this is what a game can be. Like, This is amazing. And I consumed every RPG I could get my hands on for decades as a result of that game. You know, I went back and played Final Fantasy. I played through the earlier Dragon Warrior. They had all of them. They had had 2 and 3, which were also very, 3 especially was rare.
Hope they still have them because those are pretty
expensive.
right?
I know they're probably pretty valuable. But that is my favorite Nintendo game, and I will be forever grateful for that getting me into that. And I checked it out. So that got ported to the DS. Dragon Warrior 2 and 3 got ported to the Game Boy Color, and I really enjoyed playing those on the Game Boy Color as well. And I still, every once in a while, will fire up 3, which did a really cool thing where you can like play through generations. That's pretty neat.
Well, I know 10 or 11 did something similar to that, where you could like play like almost like retro style quests, where it was like it went back to the pixel art of the Dragon Warrior / Quest franchise, and that was kind of like a cool Easter egg for longtime fans.
What I've realized is that as I get older, the things I wanted as a kid, like they've made those games for me now. I can't play them anymore, right? Like I loved Demon's Souls to death, and it's like, okay, great. But then now it's like I can't spend hundreds of hours on my quest. So it's like Elden Ring remains like a game I have not gone deep into. Not because I know it's great. I just know myself, and I know as soon as I start playing it, it's going to push every other game aside.
Yeah.
Every other game I need to play for work, for like fun and work, and it's just going to like absorb me. Same with the Dragon Quest today, where I'm like, I want to play these things, but I need so what I usually do is I save them up and play them over Christmas breaks.
That's the way to do it.
I know, it's just that month, right? It's kind of in this industry, you get a little time, and then you just rip on a bunch of games you've been waiting to play all year.
After that first week of December, most companies take a break, and then you have plenty of time to just get through all you need to do. But of course, then you have all the family obligations. You sometimes have travel involved with that, so
yeah.
That's when Switch becomes the MVP.
Yeah, I sacrifice sleep usually until I. No, but those are my 2, man, and there've been a lot of them in between too. I mean, the Super Nintendo. Actually, if I were to say what system is probably in my heart, like one that Sega Saturn and Dreamcast, but Super Nintendo too has a soft spot. So it's tough to not, but those are the most influential, for sure.
I'm very jealous that you kind of had those formative moments with RPGs because I didn't get into RPGs until much later.
Yeah.
My first RPG was the Pokemon franchise. You know, we were talking about Pokemon before we started recording, and like, you know, I still remember the Christmas that I got my Game Boy Color and Pokemon Blue, and that was kind of like baby's first RPG, right? Or it's like, okay, well, I have my party, I have my progression, I can teach them moves and stuff. And then Final Fantasy X was like my first, like, okay, this is like a real RPG, and that's why it's always going to be my favorite RPG, because like it's one of those like, oh, this is what a game could be. So the same way you could with like Dragon Warrior 4, it was like just a complete game changer, and I think that like
it was a special game.
It really
was
like,
a special game. Beautiful.
That was such a leap forward.
Cinematically, like unlike anything I had seen before too.
God. That was the game that made me decide I needed to buy a PS2. Yeah. I was at a friend's house for like youth group or something like that, and he was like, "Hey, check out this game that I got," and it was like Final Fantasy X, and I was like,
"You're like, okay,
this is what video games can be."
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
And there was one of those like, "Oh, graphics will never be better than this" moments, and obviously, like you go back and play it today, it still looks good.
It's
but
aged well. It's aged well for
definitely a 22-year-old game.
Some of those PS2 games have aged really well. And I think the ones that used a lot of colors, like the Valkyrie Profile on PS2, I think I look that up every once in a while, and I loved playing that game, and like that aged so well. But it's funny you mentioned that, just about those like Pokemon, and there was this Super Nintendo game called Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, which was the like that was supposed to be the like, you know, baby's first RPG kind of thing. I remember playing it and being like, what is this? This sucks. Like, you know, give me Final Fantasy 3. But yeah, like those were like, I think that was Square's initial intent there. And I have like a lot of fun moments with Pokemon. But mine was also like, I was in late middle school, and I remember just like secretly playing Pokemon to death. Like being ready for the pre-order and like hanging out. I had a pre-order. They even came with a little traveling case because I had pre-ordered it. And I was so into RPGs by that point in time. I had known about Pokemon from Japan because I was like tracking. I was tracking a lot of Japanese RPGs and like trying to. Like I'd like download translations of Grandia and stuff like that. And yeah.
You were in it.
That eventually, you know, you can only go so far with those things, and but that was like a really cool time, and yeah, like RPGs were my thing. That and tactical RPGs for a very long time, and then you realize like, oh wait, these take a long time to complete, and you got to have the commitment and they were great when I had almost unlimited time, but less for a life where I can play in like 1 hour increments.
Yeah, it's very difficult because like also RPGs, like if you put them down, like if you get busy in life and like, all right, I'm not going to be near my console for the next 2 weeks.
Totally.
You might as well just start over.
Yeah.
Because there's such little grace there in terms of like, I need to like remember what's going on in the story. I need to remember what's going on with the controls. Like what attacks did I just unlock that I need to like remember how to use in like my strategy in this battle.
And I have a general rule of thumb where like if I have to keep a to-do list, I just don't want to play the game. I can't, or I just literally can't. I have an actual to-do list in my life. Like I don't need, you know, and I remember playing Witcher 3 and I had like a running note going of like all this stuff I needed to do, and I'd open it up and look at I'm like, why am I feeling stressed right now? Like my cortisol level's rising. Like, uh-oh, that's a bad sign. When I'm like playing my game to do chores basically. And Witcher 3 is amazing. That's not to take anything away from that game. That is the game I would have wanted as a kid, right? Like they made the game that I wanted when I was a kid. And then I played it as an adult, and I'm like, this feels like chores. Like it's an amazing game, it's beautiful, but I'm like keeping an active to-do list. It's like got a little bit of a string attached to me at all times. It's like sucking my energy in the, you know, most Buddhist way possible. And so now I try to, I mean, I play a lot of games, obviously, but the ones that I play for fun are just ones that I can like really pick up and play. And that's something I'll say about the Naughty Dog games, is they're so linear. Like the story you can kind of walk away from and come back to, and it's not too tough. Mm-hmm. But there's not a like checklist of things to do.
Yeah.
You know, when you're playing Uncharted 4, you mentioned it earlier, like you're just going from beginning to end. And I used to hate games like that. I was like, no, give me branching narratives. And I do have an exception for this, which we'll talk about later on in the podcast, because I think they did it about as well as a branching narrative can be done. But there is something beautiful now about just like experiencing the game and like moving through it. And I always appreciate a game that you can put down and come back to a week later and feel like you're not
like you never left it.
Yeah, that's what scares. So that's why I wait for the holidays, because that's the only time I can like consistently play a game all the way through.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So we have gone 35 minutes talking about just the intro question here.
Isn't this what your podcast normally is like? Isn't this what we normally do on a podcast? This is what Brian and I normally do when we hang out. We just like play video games and talk about nothing, and then 3 hours pass. And,
exactly.
Yeah.
But I wanted to get a little bit into like, your job.
Yeah.
Your history
Yeah.
with Atari. So
Okay.
I guess kind of talk me through your history with this company. Like,
Sure.
how much affection did you have for Atari coming into it? Like, what was your kind of view of the company before you joined? Like, just
Yeah.
talk me through your history with Atari.
Well, I mean, I must have watched Blade Runner on repeat for most of my high school and college life. So I had this deep affinity for Atari, but mostly through what it stood for. And I did play a lot of the games. My first exposure to Atari, beyond the 2600s that were around in the arcades, were the first PC we bought had all of these classic Atari games on it. So Tempest and Missile Command and Asteroids and Centipede. And I loved them all. I remember playing them for hours. And Tempest especially was just this like, I was blown away by the graphics. I'm like, whoa, this is, and I found out how old the game was, and I'm like, what? This is like beautiful. Like, I don't even know how they made this. So, I do have a deep affinity for Atari, and it's only grown as I've gotten to know it better and discovered all these real hidden gems or not even hidden gems. Like I mentioned, Berserk and River Raid and things like that. What brought me to it was just a love of video games, and I was at a point in my career where I had the opportunity to go back into tech and to do another tech company, and which I had done a couple times before, or to move into video games, or to do something that I was really passionate about. And I stopped and asked, like, well, what are you passionate about? What do you really care about? And the one thing that I'd been passionate about my entire career, life, really, since the moment I saw Super Mario Brothers, was video games.
Mm-hmm.
Read about them, I played them everywhere I went. When I lived, didn't matter what country I lived in or where I was, they were always with me. Like, if I was lonely, there was Castlevania Symphony of the Night to play or something. And it was like this beautiful thing. And for me, I felt like I was ready in my career to do something I was passionate about. Because I had thought about it earlier and was really worried that if I went into something I was passionate about, it would kill my passion.
Yeah.
And so I decided to try it, to make a conscious effort. And I started a retro video game company called Ziggurat Interactive.
Mm-hmm.
Still around, doing really cool stuff. For people who love Enclave, they just put out Enclave a month ago. They've got a great game coming out called Slave Zero X, which is a brand new prequel to the Slave Zero game.
They acquired the Blood Rain franchise, right?
Oh yeah. So there's some cool stuff they're working on in the Blood Rain franchise, and I'll let them announce it. I'm no longer involved in that and the management of that, but they're amazing and they do really great work. But that brought me in touch with Atari, and then the opportunity to step in and eventually run Atari came up through that, and it was unexpected, but when the call came, I couldn't turn it down, and I'm really grateful to be here. It still is, we always joke it's the 50-year startup.
Yeah.
it's got, it is truly one of the most recognizable brands in the world, yet it's just, it's 30 of us just working as hard as we can to like make cool things and do interesting things and work with people that we love and think and whose work we really respect. So yeah, that's that's what brought me there and what we do.
Man, talk about a roller coaster there with like, kind of coming into this role of this company that had such a reputation back in like the 70s and 80s and still is so recognizable to this day. I mean, look at Ready Player One. So many Atari references in there. So like it's still culturally relevant, but like how did you assess the state of the company like coming into it?
Assess is I would say I got the call and I chose to like answer the call, and then I think the assessment really happened. The company's changed a lot. When I stepped in, we weren't really doing anything in premium gaming.
Mm-hmm.
We had put out Missile Command Recharged, and that was about it. Most of our focus was on free-to-play gaming, and we still do. We still have RCT Touch, which is a really successful free-to-play game, and something that we've put a lot of time and continue to put a lot of time and energy into. But a big shift was just getting back to games. I personally felt like Atari had become a company that was everything but games, and it just bummed me out.
Yeah.
I wanted Atari. I wanted to live in a world where Atari made games and made good games, and I also didn't, want to make games that were the exact same as what everybody else was making. Mr. Run and Jump, which thank you for reviewing recently, was a good example of that. That wasn't an Atari game, but there was an actual 2600 game built in assembly that was brought to me, and I played and said, "This is amazing. It feels like Super Meat Boy. We have to make this into a modern game. Like, if we can make Super Meat Boy on the 2600, we can definitely make it on the PS5." And so like we to be able to work with the old IP to do games that are to introduce story and narrative and characters to games that didn't have that before, but also to have an emphasis on skill gating, on just drop in and play. You don't need to like go in through a tutorial for an hour. You can just pick up Centipede Recharge and be playing it in 2 minutes with a friend, and it's easy and simple. I just wanted to make things like that. AKR, to work with somebody like Jeff Minter to make a new. Everybody loves Tempest 2000, 3000, 4000. Well, I mean, most people haven't played 3000, but 2000 and 4000. Be able to work with a legend like that to just make a game that is so weird and strange and has never been done before, and bring it to life. That's ultimately what I wanted to do. So that was the reason, and there wasn't a lot of that when I came on board, I guess. Or when we started this up. I said me, but it was really putting together the whole team, and we built. There are some great people that were with Atari before, and we've just built a really great supporting cast around a lot of those people too.
And I remember I was one of the first people to get my hands on the Atari VCS, which is the console that Atari has put out, and it's based on Android. Is that what is it?
No, it's not. It is Linux.
Linux. Okay, I knew it was an existing operating system that it was built on top of. And I remember in that same context, like the person who was showing me the demo was like, "Oh, we also have these speaker hats, and like the logo is so recognizable." And it almost felt like the sales pitch was more about like the brand recognition of Atari than like, "Oh yeah, we're doing these amazing things with the console." And I like that now Atari is branching out into these different, like actually creating games again instead of just like kind of reliving past glories.
Yeah. No, and I mean, the brand is amazing, and it is a big part of what drew me in. I mean, to have a platform to build something. I mean, I think I always say that like Atari is at home in a picture of the 70s and on Mars. It's like you can see it anywhere. It works in the past, it works in the future. It's this like futuristic retro feeling, and to have a brand and a platform to build something meaningful is invaluable, and I'm like so grateful for that. That said, there was a really large focus on everything outside of gaming, and And while we still do a lot in licensing and in hardware, if you're not making great games, like, what are you doing? You know, I mean,
You're a
we're
video game
Atari,
company.
right? Yeah. Ultimately, we're supposed to be a video game company, you know, and so we really hold ourselves to like making great games. That's what we've like challenged ourselves to do, and that's what we try to do day in and day out. And then the rest just comes as a result of that.
And one thing you've done a lot of has been finding great partners to work with. You know, like
Yeah.
you can create good games as Atari and like have internal developers, but like you worked with Digital Eclipse to work on the Atari 50 collection. I still to this day hold that up as probably the greatest compilation of retro content that's ever been released.
Yeah.
And then Mr. Run and Jump's another really great example of that. And you know, working with Jeff Minter on AKR, like you're finding the right partners to put out Atari branded content, and I think that's a really smart move.
Thank you. And another one I want to throw out there is Night Dive,
Right.
which we were able to acquire earlier this year. They also worked with us on Blood, so we were pretty familiar with Night Dive. We knew who they were and how they worked, and we just were really impressed. And they shared that retro sensibility. You know, anyone who's played System Shock, it's the reviews are like it's really interesting to read those reviews because people who played old school FPSs always rate that so highly because it's not a shooting gallery. It's not holding your hand. It's very like I wouldn't be surprised if shock-like becomes a term that gets used, you know, but for people that are kind of used to being transported from like one setting to another and you go through a shooting gallery, it's a very jarring experience. But I just was so amazed with everything they were doing in retro, beyond like with their remasters with Turok and Rise of the Triad that just came out, to like new, or I guess remakes from the ground up, like System Shock. But we get to work with them on Blood, and that was a studio that we were just so impressed with. We wanted them to be a part of the fold, and yeah.
That's such a smart move though, because like it's very difficult to cultivate talent, create a culture that is able to create like these incredible games, but working with the right people who already have that culture, already know how to make the correct games. Like Digital Eclipse is a great example of that. Like they have such a love and such a history and such a respect for that history within the games industry. Like they know their stuff about Atari. They obviously did a ton of research for putting together that compilation, and also finding all these amazing artifacts from the past and everything. But they had that built-in love. It would be like if somebody asked me, like, hey, can you do like a historical deep dive on Sonic or on Mario or Zelda? It's like, all right, I'm gonna have to do a lot of research, but I'm also like I have this built-in love for it, and it comes through in the final product.
Yeah, you don't want to have to like. That's the challenge with standing up a dev team. Is you're basically building it from scratch. Whereas if you can find a team that shares your ethos, that loves the same things you love. Digital Eclipse, for example, it's so much easier to find a way to incorporate them into the infrastructure that you have. And Night Dive was a great example because like to redo what Night Dive had already built with their Kex engine and with System Shock, I mean, it would be so challenging. It would take years and years and years, let alone to stand up that team. And so to be able to bring them on, but to allow them to operate autonomously and to work on the projects that they want to work on, and but also to be able to rely on their expertise, it's a no-brainer. And hopefully we can do more of that in the future.
Yeah, I mean, you just published that game from Graphite Labs with Mr. Run and Jump, which it fits into the identity of Atari as well, which I think is important. It's not
Absolutely.
like, in the past we've seen the Atari name slapped on like Test Drive Unlimited, and it's like, this doesn't really feel like an Atari game, but like it says it's an Atari game.
Well, it's an Infogrames game, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's the, and I always, I challenge the team with that a lot, which is, Atari, everyone ignores the 2000s for Atari, and it's a shame because the 2000s were, say what you want about Infogrames, it was amazing in its time. Like,
I love Test Drive Unlimited. It just didn't feel like an Atari game,
of course, yeah, because when I think Atari started to mean nothing. Like And that's the real work that we have to do to make sure that doesn't happen, right? Like, Test Drive Unlimited is great. Like, should Atari publish it? Probably not. A brand that might be, under the Atari umbrella, absolutely. I mean, we don't own Test Drive Unlimited, so that's maybe the wrong example, but like, that's a part of why Night Dive is such a great. They share the same ethos.
Mm-hmm.
We both have a passion and a love for retro gaming, and yet like, it makes more sense to have Night Dive publish an FPS than to have Atari publish an FPS.
Mm-hmm.
That's what Night Dive is known for. That's not what Atari is known for. And the 2000s were this great time. I mean, there was so much great content that was put out by Infogrames in that time period, but it doesn't feel like people forget it because it doesn't feel like Atari. It feels like something else because it really, when you put Atari on a retro collection and on a tennis game and on a Terminator game and on Test Drive, what does it mean? It doesn't really mean anything anymore. It's just a label that's big and broad, and I think having a more, in the video game space, having a more specific label that means something very particular is more valuable than having something that stretches across all genres.
Yeah, and it fits in with the identity, like, Vector Sector, part of the Atari 50 collection, but it's an all-new game developed by Digital Eclipse to fit in with that collection.
Totally.
It feels like a natural inclusion in that. Just like Mr. Run and Jump feels like a natural inclusion of like the Recharge series.
Yeah.
Like, those feel like they are definitively Atari products. And I know that, like, maybe in 2030, Atari's publishing like modern AAA style titles, but like, as people kind of associate the Atari franchise with like a particular, or the Atari name with a particular genre or a particular art style or a particular gameplay style, those fit as naturally as any like publisher could possibly hope for.
Yeah, and I mean, who knows? In 2030, we might be publishing AAA games. Maybe a brand that we own is publishing a AAA game.
Mm-hmm.
That's a better fit. Or maybe we won't publish AAA games. Maybe we'll decide that that's just not where we want to go. I really love what we're doing right now, and I think that comes through in the work. That comes through in the reviews. I think that maybe that's the, what I oftentimes say is like, well, just judge us on what we end up making. And if you look at it and like what we've put out, it's, they're good games. They're really fun, great, and they're the type of things that I want to play, or that like people on our team want to play, and me included, where I can like, Mr. Run and Jump, I mean, you can play that for 30 minutes or an hour. You can come back to that 2 weeks later, and you're not going to have any confusion about what you need to do.
It's not The Witcher 3 in terms of complexity.
You start at the beginning of the level, you need to get to the end. You might break a controller in the process, but
that game is so difficult at times.
I do love a tough platformer, but like, that one pushed me. I
think I need to bring up my quote here because like I did review it.
Did you ever play Celeste back in the day?
Oh yeah, I love Celeste.
I know. That's what I like channeled a lot of that when I played it. And like,
a lot of people are drawing that comparison. I was drawing the Mr. Meat Boy.
Super Meat Boy. Super Meat Boy is actually the more apt comparison. It's just fewer people. I'd say Celeste is a little bit better known, but
yeah. Here's the quote that I had in my review. The challenges that await will have you screaming in frustration until they have you shouting in triumph.
That was good. Yeah, I remember that one. That was good, Brian.
But yeah, like that's so true for that game because it is such a challenging. Like, I want to throw my controller. Like, I don't care. Like, if the Switch Joy-Con tell you to put on the wrist strap or whatever, that Joy-Con's going through the TV.
Well, in that game, it was like, this is going to be the ultimate skill gating game. Mm-hmm. We're not going to like, just because you like grinded on it for a really long time doesn't mean you like this to like progress. Like, this is skill gating, and I mean, there's a few things that it does to kind of like help ease things, but like, it really, like, when you get through it, we wanted that to feel like a sense of accomplishment.
Oh, and it absolutely did.
And I think that's the beauty of the Atari, and even in the Nintendo. Like, there was a lot of just pure skill gating that like you couldn't advance until you figured out how to clear this specific thing.
Like I always say, like, I'm not the biggest like Soulsborne fan. Like,
Right.
I got into Bloodborne for a while. I got into Elden Ring for a while. I've never gotten into a Dark Souls game. And people are always, oh, you just don't like hard games. It's like, no, I love Mr. Run and Jump.
Yeah.
I just recently talked about
I can say you love hard games. I play enough games with you. I know that you're not a stranger to it.
Blasphemous 2 just came out. That's a very challenging 2D side-scrolling Metroidvania. I had a great time with it. I've talked about on the eShop Gem of the Week.
Yeah.
I've talked about Sundered. That's a very difficult, challenging Metroidvania style game. It's got to be coming down to like the tightness of the gameplay, and I love what From Software is attempting to do there and like what they do accomplish. I just don't think that the difficulty gels with the gameplay style for my personal tastes.
Let me ask you this: did you play Demon's Souls back in the day?
I did not.
And I'm only asking that because I have this thing sometimes with movies where if people are like raving about a movie and then I go see it, I'm like instantly on guard to what I'm experiencing.
Yeah.
Where I'm like, all right, like this is too much. Like this has been pushed on me too much, and so I'm usually pretty
Try to be a little
defensive
contrarian on it.
Yeah, almost a little bit, right? And I can see like with Dark Souls, the hype around Dark Souls was so massive, and everyone talked it up to such a huge degree that to get in there, you got to be like expecting the greatest thing ever to some degree, and it still is like deeply obtuse and like very frustrating. The controls are like you'll walk off cliffs half the time and everything. I think like if I started playing it now, I'd kind of like be like I don't know if like I don't know what everybody's talking about, but like I came in having played Demon's Souls and even and the Armored Core series before that, which I was really a big fan of.
Are you gonna play the new one?
Oh yeah, I'm looking forward to that one. I mean, they're never great games. At least back in the day. Now who knows?
But now it's the developer that brought us.
It's the new From Software.
Elden Ring and Bloodborne.
Yeah.
So,
but man, I used to love Armored Core. I played all of them. I like on the PlayStation, the PS2. I just thought they were such. There was even a Japanese-only Dreamcast game. I'm gonna butcher this, called Frame Gride. I'm not sure if
Frame Gride.
I know that sounds. I think it's GRIDE. But that was really fun and cool, and it was like
Frame Gride. Yeah, I found it.
And it was like it was like those games, but you were kind of. It was like a little bit of. You had swords and stuff, so it was like mixed with like medieval. It was great. Yes, that's it. Yeah, beautiful cover art too.
It is cool cover art.
Yeah, and I picked that one up in Japan and just like really dug that game. But so I kind of came into it like knowing what to expect. But even I, at a certain point in time, was like, all right, like if everyone's telling me like. It's kind of like Rick and Morty. Like, I love it, but if somebody's got a tattoo of Rick and Morty on their arm, like, well, I'm never gonna be that big a fan.
Yeah.
Like, I gotta like deal with somebody like, kind of waving, like, really waving this thing in my face. And so I think Dark Souls took on a little bit of it became such an obsessive game that it kind of ruined the title a little bit.
No, I get that for sure. And I remember in my early 20s, I had kind of this contrarian rebellion against the Zelda franchise, because I grew up loving the original Zelda. I loved the crap out of A Link to the Past. Ocarina of Time was my favorite game of all time, but you have all these people, like, I remember in my early 20s, it was like, all right, well, Wind Waker's the greatest, and Twilight Princess is the greatest, and I remember being like, it just feels like the same formula over and over and over again. And of course, I wasn't digging deep into it. I wasn't the biggest GameCube fan.
Right.
I wasn't like a big Mario Sunshine. I didn't love Wind Waker initially. Now I think it's one of the best Zelda games ever made.
Yeah.
But like I kind of lost out on the GameCube era when it was happening because I was too involved with like the original Xbox and PS2.
PS2, yeah.
PS2 in terms of sales wiped the floor with everything.
Yeah, it was unreal. Yeah, beautiful.
But yeah, like, so I kind of went through this phase of like, well, what are we like still doing with the Zelda franchise? Like every Zelda game is the same, like fundamentally. And then like I eventually learned the error of my ways, and two of my top three or my top two favorite games of all time are both Zelda games, in Breath of the Wild and Ocarina of Time.
Yeah.
And I mean, Tears of the Kingdom is probably in there too, if I'm being honest with myself. So have you had a chance to play Tears of the Kingdom?
I have not. That's another Christmas.
You played Breath of the Wild though, right?
Oh, of course. That's why I haven't played Tears of the Kingdom. Because I have played Breath of the Wild.
Because you know what commitment it requires.
I know what's going to happen. And it's going to get so messy. I need like a couple international flights. and a
It's a
holiday.
cheat code for flights. I will
Dude.
look down for 30 minutes playing Tears of the Kingdom, and I'll look up and be like, oh, 2 hours have passed.
Just landed in Amsterdam. No, I mean, that's where I'm gonna like. I got into Breath of the Wild on a European trip. That's what it's got to be the answer because that's the only way it works. You know, you're in hotels at night, and you know after long days, you want to wind down a little bit. But no, I know myself, and so I am saving Tears of the Kingdom.
Go in as blind as you can to that because
I have not read anything.
Don't look up anything. Like there were even things that like we talked around that are fundamental aspects of it. When we did like our review of Tears of the Kingdom on this show, we didn't talk about a very specific thing that makes up a very large portion of the game. Like we want people to like explore this for themselves. Now we talk about it pretty openly.
Right.
So be careful what you like watch on YouTube and who you listen to.
But you know, I had a similar experience with Breath of the Wild. I kind of fell out of love with Zelda. And it was on a whim. I was in Europe and I was just sort of like alone and kind of having a rough trip.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, fine, I'll pick up Zelda. And I remember firing it up in my hotel and I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. And that's one of those moments where you're like, wow, this... I'm not saying anything new, right? Like this is just fact at this point in time, which is why I don't bring it up much.
Yeah.
It's also why I'll bring up Demon Souls, but not Dark Souls, because it's like people talk about it like it is fact, and it is fact to some degree, but it's annoying when it's pushed on you to such a high degree. You did mention Bloodborne, which is like my personal favorite.
It's my personal favorite of the Soulsborne. Like again, it's not my genre, it's not my developer.
The aesthetics of it are
but Bloodborne is the
cool.
closest I ever came to like getting really into it. I think I put about 10 hours into that game, and I got through Father Gascoigne, who everybody's like, oh, that's the big skill check. Like once you get through that, like you're golden.
Yeah.
And I beat him, and then I was like, I went into the swamps, and I was like, nope, I don't need to play this anymore.
I'm done.
Like there were snakes jumping in the air and like biting me, and I'm like, I don't want to do this.
I rarely platinum a game, and that was one of the few that I like set because it's a commitment, and I usually like would rather play more games than like play a game all the way to completion to get platinum, and that one I did because I just wanted to see everything and discover everything, and it was so like. But I also, again, I know, like, if I get an Elden Ring, it'll probably be the same. And, like,
it's going to be like the Tears of the Kingdom fear that you have, where it's like you're just going to get absorbed. Because...
And I'll be reading about the mythos online and, like, checking out, what does this mean? And what does this mean? And, what and you lose sleep. I lose sleep over it. And so I have to be very careful. But that's also partially why I like simple games now. Like, I mean, when I was younger, I wanted complexity because my life was simple. And now... my life is deeply complex, and I want simplicity because I don't really have the. I mean, I think as humans we want the opposite of what we have. And
always.
Yeah, and I feel like most of us have complex enough lives. I don't need to read like pages and pages. Although I would never trade that Bloodborne stuff. Like it was so cool, but I don't know if I need to like unveil an entirely new world in Elden Ring and read pages and pages of like backstory and everything because that's what I'll do. But
I mean, there's so many times that I sit down to game and I'm like, all right, I want to play something super complex. I want to get into an RPG. I want to play Final Fantasy 16. But there are even more times where I sit down and I'm like, all right, I just want to get into the action. I don't want to think too much. I'll fire up Vampire Survivors.
Yeah.
That's like my go-to. Like I don't want to think too much. I don't want to read anything. I just want to like jump in, kill some enemies, power up this guy to be like just an unstoppable killing machine. And it's just such a great turn off your brain experience. And that's what I need sometimes. But other times, I do want to play the Persona 5s. I do want to play the Tears of the Kingdoms. I do want to play the Witcher 3s or the Final Fantasy 16s. And it's just like, those are the times where those types of games come into play.
And not that, like, the reason why at Atari, but we do focus on narrative and characters and things like that. We just are very selective when we do it.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the reasons why we do focus a lot on these Vampire Survivor-esque games, it's a really good. I've never put those two together, but that's a great analogy. Is because I feel like it's underserved. Mm-hmm. I feel like there are I have Elden Ring and Tears of the Kingdom and and God of War and a bunch of other stuff that I can kind of like go into when I want to. But I don't have a lot of things that I can just fire up and play. And what is Atari, but not something that immediately you should pick up, understand within 5 seconds, and like be able to get it in this very short order. It's easy to learn, difficult to master. That's what we always say, right? That's the ethos of Atari. And even games that are much deeper and have deeper and richer stories, it still should be based on that. Like we have a new lunar lander coming out, but it still is. There's complexity. There's like narrative, and it's done by a really great team, and the team that did Chris Tales, Dreams Incorporated. Yeah,
I liked Chris Tales.
Yeah. So so it's kind of incorporating that storytelling and those aesthetics, but at its core, it's it's lunar lander.
Yeah.
You can pick it up and you're ready to go. There's not a lot to like. You're not going to be walked through a huge tutorial, but it was sort of lunar lander mixed with FTL. That was the idea and the premise behind it. I personally love FTL. I think it's one of those great games that maybe gets overlooked, but
it didn't at the time, but now
I guess
is.
I should. It didn't get over.
In retrospect, it is now.
You don't hear people talk about it much, and I still don't know if there's anything that's ever quite come up to that level of like challenge and easy to pick up to play gameplay. So yeah.
Well, you've alluded to this a little bit when we were talking about like what Atari might be doing in 2030, but like what do you see as kind of like the way forward for Atari now that you're kind of back to emphasizing gaming in the Atari brand? Like how do you see like the next decade or two playing out for Atari?
Well, I mean, gaming is a big part of it, and we'll continue to put out these really core Atari gameplay games, but we also are going to do much larger narrative, story, character-driven games based under that core gameplay, though. So we're not moving away from that, and we're just going to work with great developers, and then hopefully continue to expand the Atari umbrella, the amount of companies that exist within Atari, much like we did with Night Dive. So, when we love working with a company and when it makes sense, like bringing that into the fold, and I think there's a lot of companies doing great things, but I would really love to see Atari carve out a meaningful niche in retro gaming. I just think, and in software, hardware, everything, I feel like that's a place where people think of the brand, it immediately goes, and then it can grow and expand from there. But on gaming, I oftentimes feel that that's a very natural evolution. But we're on hardware, the VCS, we recently partnered with another hardware called Polymega, which is beautiful and amazing, and I was just blown away by it. But the idea there is to allow the VCS through the Polymega and an upcoming product they have coming out, be able to play pretty much every retro CD-based console that existed. And if it doesn't, 3DO doesn't technically, or the Jaguar CD, but I think those are on the the roadmap. But PlayStation, Saturn, Sega CD, Neo Geo CD, and then cartridge modules. So to kind of turn single points into larger retro, just expanding accessibility to retro content is a big thing we'd like to do.
It's such an important thing nowadays. Like, there's so many. What was the study that the Video Game History Foundation put out, where it was like 87% of like retro games or something like that are not accessible on modern platforms?
Well, and what constitutes a retro game? If you go back to like the PS1 era, it's 95%. Right. So I mean,
I think it's like 10 years was like the mark, or
exactly.
the line of demarcation.
Right. So you're kind of looking there. Well, that's 2013, 2012. Like some of that's PS4 still. Like that's still available.
Yeah.
Some of that's PS3. Those are a little bit more, or Xbox 360. A lot of Xbox 360 and Xbox still is. You go back to 2000s, 99. I mean, it goes downhill quickly.
It does.
And I think that's a shame, and I would love to see. I just would love to see more options there. Why not? Like it's not going to be in my top 5, so I'll bring it up. But like, I'd love to be able to play ActRaiser. Like it's a great game, man. I'm fired up, and so there's that. But then the other side of it is, Atari as a brand. It is a really meaningful brand, and I'd love to see it more in pop culture. I'd love to see it mean, we do a ton in pop culture and licensing, but to see it in media in more meaningful ways. And I hope over the next decade in 2030, it's a really large, meaningful media franchise, and that it has a lot of great sub-brands underneath it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me about kind of your role at Atari, how you see the road forward. We are going to take one quick break, the only break of this episode, and when we get back, you're not quite off the hook yet, because we're going to be doing definitive ranking and getting your eShop Gem of the Week. We'll be right back.
Let's do it.
We are back, and it is time for Definitive Ranking, a recurring segment where we take a Nintendo topic and give our personal top 5 lists. Since Atari has been reviving some of its most beloved IPs through its reimagined series and games like Aka-R, this time I want to get a list of the top 5 IPs you would wish to get revived. So start at 5, count it down to 1, give me like a sentence about each.
Ooh, okay, so 5, 1 is the most.
Yes.
Right, okay, so number 5, I would put Panzer Dragoon, and specifically Panzer Dragoon Saga.
You have a copy of that for Saturn, right?
I do, yeah. One of my all-time favorite games. Beautiful, weird, and like just a really unexplored world. Orta on Xbox was cool, but I would love to see another RPG in the Panzer Dragoon world. So that one. 5, number 4, I'm gonna do an FPS, Spec Ops: The Line.
Ooh.
Yeah. I don't play a ton of FPS, but when I do, I like them to be a little bit cerebral, and I think about that game all the time. And I know it's not the best gunplay of any game, but it is, to this day, I think a really well-made, deeply arresting version of Apocalypse Now.
Yeah, it absolutely is, and it does. I mean, Heart of Darkness is another one that they do a great job kind of paying homage to in that game, and they make you feel some things in that narrative for sure.
Number 3, I'm going to say Lords of the Realm, specifically Lords of the Realm 2. Weird choice, but I don't play a lot of strategy games anymore, and I used to play them all the time. I love it, and I feel like a new Lords of the Realm is the kind of thing that would get me into a Paradox style strategy game. And yeah, I used to sit in class and map out my plans in that game. So that's my number 3.
See, I would sit in class and design Mario levels.
Yes,
and Star Fox levels.
That's great. That's much cooler.
So that brings us to number 2.
Number 2, SNK versus Capcom Card Fighters Clash.
What?
Yeah. I put a ton of time on that Neo Geo Pocket Color game. By far my favorite Neo Geo Pocket Color game. Probably my favorite, one of my favorite handheld games of all time. And there was one made for the DS, but it doesn't count. And I would love to see that.
Hey, DS was a long time ago.
DS is fair. Yeah, that still would fall under this. But man, that was cool. That was a fun game, and I used to play with my brother a lot.
Yeah, all right, so that brings us to number 1.
All right, number 1 is a bit of a cheat for me, because I'm going to put it in the same world as my Switch or my Nintendo Game of the Week, but it is Final Fantasy Tactics.
Oh.
I do not understand why this series does not have games made in it. And this is no disrespect to the Game Boy Advance games, which were great in their own right, but like a true Final Fantasy Tactics game made, a sequel to the PlayStation game, I would absolutely play that. I would commit the time. I would carve it out, even during non-holiday seasons, to play that title. But that will flow into my Switch Game of the Week, which is probably my number 1 that I would like to see brought back. But they're all kind of the same thing, and they're all from the same team, so I think it's a twofer.
So, have you played Triangle Strategy?
I have played Triangle Strategy, yes.
What were your thoughts on that? Because I know that was billed as kind of like a spiritual successor.
Oh, man. Disappointing. Sorry, I shouldn't... it's just it like you were talking about like baby's first RPG. That felt like baby's first tactics RPG. What I will say though, the like if you compare it to Final Fantasy Tactics, or my personal favorite, which we'll talk about in a moment, but just the story, the way it unfolds, the ramifications, the like the way things are done, it just felt pretty weightless, and then the dialogue was rough. Like the dialogue was pretty inane, but the combat was great.
Yeah.
Combat was super great, and they'd set up these really fun. I think it was closer to Shining Force than FFT or Tactics Ogre, and I think the fact that it got billed as like Final Fantasy Tactics is to its disservice. If somebody would told me like, oh, it's this is the spiritual successor to Shining Force, that is actually what it feels like. I didn't think about that until right now, and really good combat. A little bit lighter on the like outside of battle stuff, and fun maps though. Fun maps to move your units around and to kind of strategize on. So some good stuff.
Yeah, great list. No overlap, which is always a favorite of mine when it comes to my list. I'm gonna run down mine real quick here. I originally had F-Zero as my number 5, but when you were going over your list and I mentioned one of these franchises, I decided to put Star Fox as my number 5. I think that there is some way to do that really well, and Nintendo just hasn't figured it out. They haven't cracked the code of how to make a good modern Star Fox. Star Fox Zero had some promise, but they shoehorned in too many gimmicks with the Wii U gamepad and everything. I think that there is a back-to-basics approach that would be a home run for that franchise.
Have you played Panzer Dragoon Orta?
No.
On the Xbox?
I loved Panzer Dragoon back on the Saturn. That was my introduction to the Saturn. That and Daytona USA were my introduction to the Saturn.
It's my favorite Xbox game.
Oh, wow.
I think it's amazing. I think it's amazing and beautiful and wildly underrated. If you get a chance...
I wonder if it's backwards compatible on Xbox.
I believe it is.
Series.
I believe it's one of the few that is, but I think it is. So if you have a chance, yeah.
Well, I'm sure it's on sale.
You will be shocked it's an Xbox game. It looks so good.
I will check that out for sure. Number 4 for me, I'm going FPS as well for my number 4 entry, Titanfall.
Yeah.
That's a game that Titanfall 1 fell short of expectations. I think a lot of people would agree with that. I was thinking that was going to be the Call of Duty killer. I was telling people like at my day job that I had at the time, like, oh my god, like forget about Call of Duty. Titanfall is going to just like be the next big thing. And then it came out and it kind of, landed with a dud. Titanfall 2, one of the greatest first-person shooter single-player campaigns I've ever played in my life. And then they were like, well, we have Apex Legends, so we don't need Titanfall anymore, even though it's in the same universe technically. And it's like, well, I would like a Titanfall 3, and a lot of people would like a Titanfall 3. So that is my most modern franchise that I would like to see revived. Number 3, Portal. Come on, I know there's so many Valve franchises that, the old joke of like Valve's allergic to the number 3. We never got Half-Life 3. We never got Left 4 Dead 3. Portal 3 is the one I want the most. Yeah. And it's just, there's never been a game that has made me think that like, oh my god, this is like the most clever game I've ever played in my life, like Portal 2. I know a lot of people point to Portal 1 as like the apex of that duology, I guess.
Oh, really? I
but
didn't know that.
Portal 2, people sometimes say it's like, oh, it's too bloated, it goes on for too long. I think that the care that is paid in the narrative and like the little like Easter eggs around the world that tell you like there's so much world building going on and so much care put in the creation of this game. That is why Portal 2 is one of my favorite games of all time.
It's got a great 2-player mode too.
It really does. I played through both the single player and the co-op.
It shocks me that Portal 2, 1 is considered better than 2. I would agree with you.
I think it's because it was such a bite-sized experience that didn't like overstay its welcome in any way, shape, or form, and it didn't like expand too much on the original premise of like, oh, you have a portal gun. Whereas Portal 2 had like much more involved narrative. It had like those gels that made you do different things and everything.
It's also funnier though.
It is much funnier.
Yeah,
and
they really
voice
lean
acting.
into the human.
I don't know if you saw in my basement. I have not only the voice actress of GLaDOS. Her signature, but also Stephen Merchant, who played Wheatley in Portal 2. I have their autographs together on my wall. Let's go to number 2. This is maybe my spiritual number 1, but Power Stone.
Ooh, Power Stone.
Talking about Dreamcast greats.
Oh, I love it. what a good one.
I'm still mad at myself. I have this habit of asking or thinking of the best interview questions after the interview's already done.
Yeah.
Like, I have this amazing joke that I interviewed Tom Holland for the Uncharted movie, and I'm like, that was coming fresh off of the Spider-Man No Way Home press tour that he just did. And I was like, everybody was asking, like, oh, Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire in this movie. And I thought it would be hilarious after the fact, of course I thought about this, where I'd be like, oh, I should start this interview with, like, so are Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire in this movie talking about Uncharted? And then when he, like, laughs it off, he's like, yeah, I've heard that one before. Like, I think of these really great interview questions after the fact, and one of my eternal regrets is that when I was at Capcom out in Osaka, I didn't ask them about Power Stone. Like, we had a rapid fire interview about Street Fighter 6, and I asked them about some other Capcom franchises, and I completely glanced over the Power Stone question that I wrote down but completely missed when I was asking them the questions for this rapid fire interview.
Power Stone 1 or 2? What's your choice?
2 is probably objectively the better game, but
Really?
I have more fond memories with Power Stone 1.
So I have played more 2 because it's 4-player, but I feel like the 4-player bloats it a little, or not even bloat. That's the wrong. But like, it feels like it was dialed in more in 1.
Agreed.
Like, it's just such a tight, awesome game. Like, I mean, I
think it's the same argument people make about Portal 1 versus Portal 2.
Maybe so. Yeah, that's a good point. They're both amazing. I've wondered that, like, a lot. Like, all right, is the super dialed in 2-player mode, or the, like, little bit looser, a little bit, like, less balanced 4-player mode?
So chaotic.
Of Power Stone? Yeah. Both great games. I would love a Power Stone. Instant buy, for sure.
I do love that if you're playing Street Fighter 6, which just came out this year, this past June.
Yeah.
You can put on your player card, like you can choose, like, oh, I'm a Street Fighter 2 fan, or I'm a Street Fighter 4 fan, or whatever. You can scroll all the way down. There's more Capcom games, like Darkstalkers, SNK, or Capcom vs. SNK. There's one that says Power Stone 1 or Power Stone 2 fan, and I chose Power Stone 2 fan as my title card. So I'm glad there's at least some acknowledgement that those games exist from Capcom.
Totally.
So my number one, it's kind of a twofer here, but it's a genre, and that is Rock Band and Guitar Hero. Because those games, I still have my Rock Band setup downstairs. I still have so many DLC songs. Every once in a while, like every few months, I will still log on to the Rock Band DLC store and like buy new songs that they put out to this day. And it's like, it's such a great like party thing of like, oh, let me have like a group of 4 friends over and we'll like rotate playing the different instruments and everything.
They still put out music.
They still put out songs, even though Harmonix was acquired by Epic Games and they largely work on Fortnite like musical events now, but they still put out weekly Rock Band songs.
Unreal. I did not
to this day, and
wow.
it's amazing. Like, and I'll log on every 3 months. I'll fire up Rock Band 4 and be like, let's see what they have, and I'll end up dropping like $12 on DLC songs because they've put out so many great like modern and classic songs. So yeah, I would love to see that franchise come back. I don't know if it ever will. I don't know if it's even smart for it to come back because the music licensing, I'm sure, is just a nightmare.
Totally.
And I can't imagine like producing all those instruments in mass is a profitable business strategy in 2023. I mean, that's why it's so hard to find those instruments now, because the company that made them, they had a licensing deal with Mad Catz, and Mad Catz went under. And it was like, okay, well, now there's no way to get instruments. So it's like if you go on eBay, those guitars are just ridiculously expensive.
Really?
The drums are they're even worse.
Wow.
So yeah, I would love to see Rock Band and Guitar Hero come back, if for no other reason than to get like a huge set of new songs, maybe a couple innovations along the way, and also some new instruments, because they're so hard. I had to go through hell to get my new guitar after my old ones broke. But Wade, that brings us to our final segment here. Yep. It's a quick one. It's one that you've been prepping for months now. It is your time to shine here. It's the eShop Gem of the Week, a chance to give a shout out to a game that maybe people overlooked on the Nintendo eShop. What is your eShop Gem of the Week?
Yeah, and this goes against what I said earlier, but this is a blast from the past, and Tactics Ogre is my eShop Gem of the Week. And it's also my twofer, because the same team that did Final Fantasy Tactics did Tactics Ogre, and I would argue it's the better the game. I think it's just the deeper, little bit more rich game of the two. And Ogre Battle as a series of all games is probably the one I would love to see come back. So I really stretched it to 6. But Tactics Ogre, I played the PSP game when that came out, and to this day, I think it is the best remaster ever made. It's my personal favorite remaster.
The PSP version.
Well, this is an extension. This is a remaster of that.
This is Tactics Ogre Reborn.
But I think it does branching narratives as well as branching narratives have ever been done. And Detroit took a little bit from that, but like outside of that, like you can play through all these various parts, but you can also rewind back to other parts, replay, so you don't have to start all the way from the beginning. Because the game is long and winding and deep and punishing if you really play it honestly and like don't reset and stuff.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. It's just a beautiful experience. I remember I think the PlayStation is under-recognized for how much it pushed forward narratives between things like that and Valkyrie Profile and
Vegas
Story. I mean, a lot of what I'm talking about is Square now that I think of it.
Yeah,
But,
maybe Square was the one that was
they were really pushing it forward, weren't they? But Final Fantasy VII, even compared to like say 3, I think it's a beautiful game. If people haven't played Tactics Ogre, it holds up really well. And that PSP, before this came out, it was worth owning a PSP just for that. And if they also, bring back Valkyrie Profile Lenneth from PSP, then PSP might be my favorite all-time console, but I'm not sure what's left after those. So there's a few others. There's a few others that haven't been brought back, but I'm really glad to see it make an appearance.
Yeah, and I know you're a big Persona 3 fan. Persona 3 Portable, which was a PSP exclusive prior to this, is now on Switch as well.
Yeah.
So that's another notch on the Switch's belt that was, one of the reasons a lot of people owned a PSP.
Totally. I know. It makes me a little sad because there's so many great... Parasite Eve, I think, had a PSP game, so maybe that probably will never be brought back, so maybe that's one. Maybe that's one reason to still own a PSP, even if it wasn't the greatest game. Very stylistic and cool, so...
Well, I've talked about this a lot, about how the Switch is such a great game for tactics fans.
Great.
XCOM 2 is on there. The Mario plus Rabbids games are so much fun. Tactics Ogre Reborn, Triangle Strategy. I know you weren't the biggest fan of it, but it's a solid tactics game.
Totally.
We have Advance Wars 1 and 2.
Made by Way Forward, a favorite of mine.
2 mainline Fire Emblem games are now on there.
Right, yeah.
So it's there are so many great... And, Persona 5 Tactica is on the horizon for this holiday season. There's a lot of great tactics games, and all we need is Final Fantasy Tactics to really make the leap over, right?
Or just a brand new one. Come on.
Or
just don't port us the same
We're getting
thing.
Mario RPG. I never thought we would get a remake of Mario RPG coming to Switch.
I want a full-on sequel to Final Fantasy Tactics. I want to see Invalis and understand it and know what is going on that island and I don't know, in that continent. But that's the one where I keep coming back to it. And I'm like, why can't we have another one of this? I mean, Tactics Ogre Battle and Tactics Ogre I get a little bit more obscure, but Final Fantasy Tactics, there's got to be a big enough community for a true sequel.
I can't believe that Square Enix has never done anything with that, really.
Yeah.
There's never really been I guess we got what was it, on DS?
Oh, another good tactic game. They're redoing the front missions.
Oh, right,
the front mission just came. The old remaster of the old one, and I think they're going to redo 2 and 3.
Yeah.
Which I have not played 2 and 3, so I'm looking forward to that.
There you go.
And 5, I would love to see 5 get ported over to the US. That's got it on PS2 from Japan, but again, having the translation sitting next to you and playing the game is not quite the same.
No.
So that would be a nice one. That would be a nice journey over if it ever can get done.
Well, fingers crossed that those first 4 front mission remakes do well and they can justify bringing over a localization for the first time. But Wade, thank you so much for joining me for this episode.
Ryan, thank you, man. This is great.
Yeah, it's been awesome. And thank you so much to everyone for listening. Do me a favor, if you haven't already, throw All Things Nintendo a 5-star review and hit that subscribe button. If you want to get any questions or comments in, you can hit me up at allthingsnintendo@gameinformer.com or you can hit me up on social media at Brian Pichet. That is on Twitter, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, whatever ends up panning out in this social media landscape that we're currently in. And as always, you can join the Game Informer community Discord by subscribing to our Twitch channel, even just for 1 month. Wade, go ahead and tell people where they can find you online.
Oh man, I am not as online savvy as you, but you can go to Atari.com and see everything we're doing with Atari, and our Discord page, and please follow us on our Steam publisher page, which is Atari. It's pretty easy to find, so that's where you can find me.
That is our show for this week. Thank you all again so much for listening. Take care. We will see you next time.